C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici ce soir. I'm not going to go through the long list of people who could be thanked, partly because, Dan, you said it yourself with the message from the Quebec consulate, and there are many, many people who could be thanked. I do just want to add a personal word of thanks to Sylvia Sutherland, thanks to whom I was asked to be the guest creative editor for this issue. I'm not going to read from a prepared text. I'm just going to speak very casually and informally and briefly. And mostly I think I'm going to talk about invisibility. Because in the country where I live, north of the border, we live enveloped in the culture of one particular country from the Americas, namely the United States. And so if I think of the clothing shops that my daughters go to, it might be American Apparel and American Eagle, and the movies that people watch, American Beauty, American Pie, was the top end American Beauty and the bottom end American Pie there. And the music would include things like Born in the USA and American Woman, so on and so forth. But what does Canada mean in the United States? And thinking about this today, I decided that in all likelihood it meant a bird and a beverage. There's the Canada Goose and there's Canada Dry Ginger Ale. And I'm not sure if I had to choose between those two, which I would actually choose. So in a sense, we are literally off the map. Because if I look at the weather forecasts that I see on American television, which comes regularly into my city and most other Canadian cities, the map stops at the border. So as I'm sure many of you realize, more than half the Canadian population lives pretty close to New York City. You know, the Windsor-Quebec City corridor, which includes a very large percentage of the Quebec population. People who live there are actually closer to New York than people who live in Chicago or St. Louis or Denver or Atlanta or Houston or LA. And yet, somehow in psychological terms, it's as if Canadians don't quite exist. And this despite the great work that Pamela Wallen has done over the years here in New York. There is perhaps one way in which Canadians are on the map, and that's when blizzards come down and hit Boston and New York City and Chicago, and then it's a cold front coming down from Canada. But apart from that, which is not exactly what I particularly want to be known for, I think Canadians still tend to suffer here from certain invisibility. If you'll forgive me speaking in personal terms for a moment, I had a very interesting example of this over the last year. I have a nonfiction book, The Prodigal Tongue, which will be coming out next month from Houghton Mifflin. And it was commissioned and edited in New York. The first editor left to move over to another firm while I was still late in the first draft. So I worked with two different editors in New York. And the first editor, who was a wonderful, wonderful editor, Eamon Dolan, a very, very smart man, Eamon read the first draft and he said to me, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but could you cut some of the Canadian references? There's too much of Canada in this book. And so the result is that when I had said Canadian novelist Russell Smith, it now becomes novelist Russell Smith, whereas American writer Bill McKibben remains American writer Bill McKibben. Then Eamon left, went to Penguin, and I was taken over in the editing by an equally fine editor, Jane Rosenman. And Jane read the last few chapters, and also what had been done before, and she looked at the chapter I have on language in cyberspace, and she said, you know, Mark, I really like this, but there's too many Canadian references in it. Can you cut some of the Canadianisms? So once again, I had to do that, and I felt a little bruised in the process, only slightly bruised, because I didn't actually take out the quotations or the references. I just had to make sure that no one in the United States or Britain, where the book will also be published, knew that the people I was writing about were actually Canadian. I do think that to some extent, though, lest you think this is veering dangerously close to anti-Americanism here in the Americas Society, I do think that this is to a good extent our own fault. Canadians have never been very good at self-promotion. We've traditionally been very self-deprecating. And I mentioned a few examples before of American terms which are part of popular culture in Canada. Well, American Apparel was in fact founded by a Canadian, a Montreal Jewish guy who moved to LA. And American Woman, of course, was a song by the Guess Who from Winnipeg. So the Guess Who did not choose to write a mega hit called Canadian Woman. Canadians blend in. When we come down here, as we do, we often, if we're talented enough, and I'm not including myself in that company particularly, but people like Joni Mitchell, Leonard Cohen, and Neil Young, who've achieved great success in popular culture in North America, they've done so without being ostentatiously identified as Canadians. They've simply been North American artists. The same with actors, whether it be older ones like William Shatner or now young ones like Ellen Page, broadcasters like Peter Jennings. In many ways, Canadians are accepted and can pass for generic Americans in the United States. And I'm reminded that CBC Radio once had a competition to come up with the best answer to the phrase "as Canadian as." And I don't know if any of you remember the winning entry, but the winning entry was "as Canadian as possible under the circumstances." I think that says a good deal about Canada. So to move swiftly along to Review 76, my role was, I thought, to make sure that there was enough diversity in the entries, in the contributions, and to make sure that there was work of high quality in the contributions. And speaking as someone who does not necessarily always have a great deal of sympathy for the current Prime Minister of Canada, I did feel more sympathy than I usually do when it came to putting together a list of contributors, because in limited space, I wanted to make sure that there was a fair diversity of genres, and so there is nonfiction, short fiction, drama, excerpts from long fiction, and poetry in these pages. A diversity of style, a diversity of place, and there are indeed writers from British Columbia, from the prairies, from Northern Ontario, Southern Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland. And also a diversity of background, of heritage, if you like. If I think back to the Canadian anthologies that I grew up with, there was one particular anthology of Canadian poetry I remember, English Canadian poetry I should specify, and the contributors to this anthology almost all had names like H.A.M. Smith, F.R. Scott, Bliss Carman, Archibald Lampman. They were all male and they were all of British stock. Thankfully, that is not the case any longer. Canada has become a nation of enormous diversity in many senses of the word, and I'm very proud that that diversity is reflected in these pages. But even more important than the diversity, what mattered to me was making sure that the writers were of superb quality, so that readers in the United States or elsewhere who were coming fresh to this material would discover work that really deserved to be discovered. And I'm very proud of the work that I assembled for this issue and of the three writers who are extremely diverse in many senses who are here tonight. Thank you.